A dire warning about climate change. According to a new report, experts say that we have until 2030.
It's human activities that are responsible for climate change.
Climate change is accelerating. In spite of the COVID-19 pandemic, carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere are still rising, and the impacts are already being felt faster and harder than expected. Heat waves, droughts, destructive storms, flooding, melting glaciers, and sea level rise are causing destruction and dislocation around the world. We need a global transformation to achieve a low-emission, climate-resilient world. But we're still not on track. If we act now, we can still limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And by doing so, we will generate trillions of dollars of green investment opportunities. The Green Climate Fund works with the private sector to remove barriers to climate investment in developing countries. Working with developing countries to support integrated strategies, planning and policy making that create an enabling environment for private sector investment. Piloting new technologies, business models, and financing instruments to accelerate climate innovation. Using public funds to de-risk projects, crowd in private finance, and make blended finance work for early-stage technologies and early-stage markets. Supporting domestic financial institutions to mainstream climate considerations, aligning finance and sustainable development, so they are empowered to lead the shift to low-emission, climate-resilient development pathways. Our future is at stake. Public and private sectors need to work together to realize the transition to the world we need, because businesses cannot succeed on a planet that fails. Let's work together for our planet.
Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the opening session of the 4th Annual Private Investment for Climate Conference, GPIC, hosted by the Green Climate Fund, the GCF. I'm Babita Bisht, Deputy Director of External Affairs, and on behalf of the team, I have the honor of opening this high-level session titled, Promoting a Conducive Investment Environment to Unlock Private Sector Finance for Low-Carbon, Climate-Resilient Development. We are privileged to welcome a group of distinguished speakers today, representing governments, international organizations, including the UN Secretary General's Office and the private sector. Their vision and insights will set the direction for the coming sessions. Please allow me to introduce the Executive Director of the GCF, Mr. Yannick Lemaric, who will chair the session. And the panel will be moderated by Mr. Henry Gonzalez, our Director of the Private Sector Facility. A few quick housekeeping rules before we begin. We have simultaneous interpretation in French and Spanish with automated captioning in several languages. We invite you to share your questions to our panelists through the Q&A function during the session. And if you're on social media, please use the hashtag GPIC 2021 and tag GCF in your posts. I will now hand over to Mr. Lemaric, who will make the opening remarks. Thank you so much.
Many thanks, Babita. His Excellency, Mr. Carlos Alvarado Quesada, President of the Republic of Costa Rica, Professor Lee White, CBE, Minister of Water and Forests, the Sea and the Environment of the Gabonese Republic, Mr. Sewin Hart, Special Advisor to the Secretary General on Climate Action and Assistant Secretary General for the Climate Action Team, Ms. Jacqueline Novagras, CEO of Acumen, Ms. Joan Larrea, CEO of Convergence. Dear colleagues, dear friends, on behalf of the Green Climate Fund, it is an honor to welcome you today to our annual Private Investment for Climate Conference. I think you will agree that this year's conference is very timely, coming just 2 weeks before the start of COP26 in Glasgow. The role of the private sector in addressing the increasingly urgent needs to upscale global climate action is a key feature of the climate negotiation in Glasgow. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change stated in its latest report in August that global carbon emission must fall by half by 2030 to keep global heating below 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial level, as required under the Paris Agreement. The following month, the UN reported that countries' current pledges to tackle climate change under their nationally determined contribution would lead to a 16% rise in the next decade, prompted a code red for humanity warning by the UN Secretary General. Superposed to this emission gap is a widening adaptation gap, with almost daily report of climate destruction and dislocation. In turn, these emissions and adaptation gaps create a widening financing gap, particularly in developing countries. The current gap for funding developing countries' ability to adapt to climate change only is estimated by the UN at $70 billion annually. It is a multiple of this amount to accelerate the transition to net zero emission. Supporting the transition to a low-carbon, climate-resilient economy in line with the goal of the Paris Agreement will require significantly more investment in a different set of assets, and investment that address the humanitarian imperative of social inclusion and poverty alleviation. The pledge to provide $100 billion annually to developing countries is a central feature of the global architecture built to tackle this unprecedented global challenge. We need to keep striving to reach this goal. With the OECD indicated that we were still over $20 billion short in 2019. Ultimately, though, this climate finance under the UNFCCC needs to be used in a highly catalytic way so that we can move from billions to trillions. To drive this financial transformation, we need to work with the private sector to turn around the paradox that lies at the heart of climate finance. On the one hand, trillions of dollars are earning negative interest rates in many OECD countries. On the other hand, low-carbon, climate-resilient investment opportunities could yield a direct economic gain of 26 trillions through to 2030. This flow should particularly benefit developing countries, where the bulk of investment in low-emission, climate-resilient infrastructure is to take place in the coming decades. But this is not happening because of barriers that are hampering climate innovation and blocking large-scale flows of private climate finance to capitalize on these investment opportunities in developing countries, particularly LDCs, seeds, and African states. These barriers exist at all stages of climate innovation, from incubation to early stage growth, and then during the phase of commercializing and deploying innovation. They include policy and regulatory risk, as well as technical and, above all, financial barriers, particularly the lack of access to affordable long-term project finance. GCF is now a $10 billion fund, $37.2 billion, including co-financing, following the latest GCF board's approval of 13 new climate funding proposals at its meeting earlier this month. And as the largest dedicated climate fund, GCF is using its resources to help overcome barriers to innovation and catalyze the movement of far greater flows of finance to address climate action in developing countries. GCF approach is built upon a four-pronged model to accelerate and scale up transformative climate innovation in developing countries, including establishing a conducive environment for climate action. Second, encouraging innovation by facilitating the emergence of new climate solutions. Third, mobilizing finance at scale to deploy new climate solutions. And fourth, aligning finance with sustainable development to accelerate the widespread adoption of new climate solutions. Each of these four prongs will be discussed during this conference. A supportive regulatory environment and public support are essential to remove barriers to climate innovation and investment. Bloomberg New Energy Finance found that, on average, countries with strong policies to support clean energy attract 7 times as much clean energy investment as emerging markets without such policies. Direct public support is equally important. In addition to their role as enablers, governments are essential to the creation and development of new markets as customers through green procurement and co-financing via subsidies, sovereign guarantees, and co-investment. GCF grant-based readiness program aim to strengthen the capacity of countries to design, finance, and implement integrated climate strategies and policies. While private sector involvement in the first iteration of nationally determined contribution was limited, our readiness program supports cross-sectoral and public-private sector engagement for the formulation and implementation of the new generation of NDCs. And as we face the challenge of recovering from the COVID-19 economic shock, we are leveraging these readiness resources to assist developing countries in designing green, climate-resilient economic stimulus measures and in exploring innovative financing instruments to finance them without increasing their debt burden. Second, GCF investment are also accelerating innovation. We are supporting incubators and accelerators to help climate innovators in developing countries refine business model and pilot new climate solutions. We are also developing specialty financing instruments to provide early-stage capitals to startups and SMEs. Here, I will briefly highlight our new $279 million investment in the Amazon Bioeconomy Fund, which will take an innovative approach to protecting this vital part of the global ecosystem by supporting bio businesses across 6 Latin American countries to reducing emission and enhancing climate resilience. And we are working to mobilize private finance to deploy new solutions at scale, or third prong. Through new form of blended finance, we aim to use scarce public resources to de-risk market-creating projects and crowd in private finance. For instance, GCF is investing $150 million of first loss equity into the Global Subnational Climate Fund, which will de-risk private sector climate investment at this critical subnational level. Almost half of the 42 participating countries are LDCs and seeds. And finally, our fourth prong, we are strengthening domestic financial institutions to support the widespread adoption of commercially proven new climate solutions. We assist domestic financial institutions in developing new appraisal methodologies to balance the higher upfront cost of climate solutions with their lower operational cost and lower vulnerability to climate change. We also help them originate and develop climate investment, as well as access capital markets to finance them. As mentioned in the introductory video, we are working with the government of Jamaica to establish the first Caribbean exchange for green bonds to finance net zero climate resilient infrastructure in the Caribbean regions. Your Excellencies, dear conference participants, it is only through innovative partnership that we will be able to overcome the climate challenge. And the importance of the partnership between the private and public sectors cannot be overstated. The participation of His Excellency President Alvarado and senior government officials in the opening session of GPIC is a vivid testimony of it and a unique opportunity to deepen it. I wish you plenty of fruitful discussions to strengthen this partnership to help us create a zero carbon, climate resilient future. Back to you, Babita.
Thank you so much, Yannick. And it is my privilege to invite President Quesada Alvarado to provide his opening remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you to Yannick and to you, Babita, and all the people that are joining this session, which is so relevant. It's one of the key features of how we need to address climate change. So let me just, my presentation, if I may, will be like in two parts. I will be talking about our experience in Costa Rica related to finance in the private sector, and in the other part, more a global perspective of what is going on now and what are some opportunities that I believe I can share. First of all, I want to talk about 20 years ago. 20 years ago, I used to work in a program here in Costa Rica, and it's still called Payment for Environmental Services. So I remember 20 years ago, when we were talking about payment for environmental services of the forests to the community and to the world, being those services, the protection of water, fixing carbon, the protection of ecosystems for biodiversity, and also the protection of ecosystems for tourism. 20 years ago, when we used to talk about this, it was very abstract for people in general. They say, well, we have always had forests, and basically we take this for granted. But as we were striving to do that, we started to see the benefits out of a program as Payment for Environmental Services, both paid by public sector through a tax on fossil fuels and with certain alliances with the private sector. The Payment for Environmental Services program is one of the key programs that had allowed Costa Rica to go from a forest coverage of 20% during the 80s of last century, currently to more than 50% of our territory covered with forests. So with this program and with our strategies of national parks and national reserves and private reserves, we managed to reverse deforestation. And this is a key insight. Actually, the Payment for Environmental Services was the program that yesterday was awarded with the award of the Earthshot that Prince William delivered. So what are key insights of Payment of Environmental Services? One, change of paradigm. Time ago, people said, well, this is very abstract, but you're talking about services of something we take for granted. Now it's not that abstract, it's very concrete. The necessity to fix carbon, to protect water, to protect biodiversity loss in ecosystems. And also, not only that it is necessary for the planet, but it's profitable socially and economically. Our tourism model is based on ecotourism. It's based a lot on the protection of our forests and ecosystems. So there, even though it's very indirect at that time, you have a public-private alliance. Why? Because from the public part and some private part, you get to finance these schemes, but the benefit, economic benefit, it's used by the private sector. In which way? Development small businesses on tourism or medium-sized businesses that benefit all the community in all the country. So there's a very stretched alliance between this kind of public-private scheme and business. In the case of tourism, I see many similar possibilities in certain areas that, drawing from this example, we can reproduce. For example, in sustainable agriculture, going for the NAMAS, for example, the Adaptation and Mitigation Scheme, is a way in which we can invest and add value to businesses in order to make it more sustainable, but at the same time to have better goods for citizens and customers that demand not only quality goods, but goods that are adapted to climate change and mitigate the impacts. Also, the kinds of schemes of payment of environmental services, now not only in the forest, but in the oceans. If we have the ability, as we have already in the forest, not only to measure the impacts but also to provide traceability for those who fund, we can provide the trust of the real impacts, and that can help mitigate or compensate emissions, for example. And that could be investment in forests or in the oceans. So one key element is to have the capabilities for measurement and traceability of those services or their benefits and how they mitigate the impact. Similar, we're moving in that direction and doing that with the Green Climate Fund in transportation. One of our great projects is to build a fully electric train in Costa Rica that is going to heavily mitigate our carbon emissions. And given that Costa Rica's electric grid is 99.5% clean and renewable, that will be a fully clean train by clean energy, propelled by clean energy. So I think in this first part, I want to say that trust is key. Having concrete measures and traceability is key because it's there that you can draw the results, especially for the private sector. Private sector is data-driven, is driven by concrete results, also by purpose, and I want to talk a bit about that. But then to provide the evidence for purpose, you need to provide also those concrete results. And my take is that it is possible to make that very profitable, not only in a moral and ethical sense, which it is, but also in economic sense. Just to give you last example, Costa Rican coffee. Costa Rican coffee, it's only 2% of the global coffee market. But given our policies and given a strategy on quality, even though we only produce 2%, and our more than 50% of our coffee is NAMA certificated, we take double of the price of the international price. Actually, we do not follow the international price. So there you have kinds of investments in which you can have added value and increase returns. And this, I can say, it's moving to other industries. Just to give another example, Bayer just opened a operation in Costa Rica for women's contraception systems, but took the decision to move here because of our sustainability policies, not only in environment, but across the board of the SDGs. And just as an anecdote, but it's how to prove how this has traction and it moves investment. A rock band as Coldplay just announced they are going to start their world tour in Costa Rica. And why? Because their footprint here is going to be one of the lowest because of how we produce energy. And that's also where you can draw attention to this. If you want in a marketing way, but it's not marketing, it's what young people, for example, are looking for. So how to measure traceability, purpose, and move into other directions. In the second part, I want to talk about the three crises we are experiencing currently. We have the COVID crisis, which has been kind of an accelerator of things getting more complicated, not only in a pandemic, but in a syndemic, as some call. We have the climate crisis, which it's also not only climate change, but it's biodiversity, the accelerated loss of biodiversity, and also the loss of land to cultivate and our capacity to feed the world. So those three are present there, and those three, which each one of them has a convention of the United Nations to address them. The three are part of one dilemma. And the third crisis, particularly in the developing world currently, and accelerated by COVID, is the fiscal crisis. Most of the emerging world, mid-income countries and poor countries are suffering a fiscal crisis. Not only because now the economies went down during COVID and we are recovering, but also because in the developing world, we had to invest a lot to address COVID while our economies were decreasing. And at the same time, many of our countries had to invest in adaptation and particularly in reconstruction. Let's remember that in this area of the world, Central America and the Caribbean, from June to November of every year, we experienced the hurricane season. And during that season, what we have experienced is that hurricanes are becoming more strong and more extreme. So we end up building and rebuilding sometimes, even though we are doing our efforts to adaptate. So that's putting lots of pressure on our budgets. One thing, and I'm going to mention what Yannick said about that paradox. While in the OECD's countries and in the developed world, you have negative interest rates, when you talk about the financement of the developing countries, and here I want to say, this is across the board of all developing countries. I think the spectrum has to be of all the developed world. The risk assessment agencies always qualifies us as very risky. And the cost of the financement for our countries is very high, very high. The risk assessment agencies do not take into account COVID or climate change risks or adaptation. So we have to add on that paradox, Yannick, which is this is a strong paradox. Most of the solutions for climate change, particularly in nature-based solutions, are in the developing world. For example, in the tropics, in the mangroves, in the forests, in the oceans. So most of the solutions are there. Where there's the great lack of finance. And also, it's the developing world, the one that least pollutes. And you can have this point very clear when you talk, for example, with the Caribbean countries. They say, we don't have dirty industries. Our industries are tourism, and by the way, very hit by COVID. We're receiving the harshest part of this because we're islands or in the Caribbean, and we have to mobilize our people whenever there is a hurricane or a flood. We have problems to finance our development, and we are not polluting. So there's a possibility there for investments that are not going to be negative in their interest rates, but they are not going to be as they should not be as the risk agencies are pointing us. Because if that's the case, their change is not going to happen. So there is a missing link there, again, of how you can invest. First, the purpose is there. I know people want to invest and want to contribute for change. But then the missing link has to do, well, we need to see more of those benefits in our businesses, or we have to see the concrete benefits for our stakeholders and for the world. So then again, we have to go to measuring, traceability, and accountability, and how those investments, name it transportation, innovation in agriculture for sustainability, forests, or oceans, how those investments, which are very key and necessary, are going to give back in purpose, which is very important. Let's not undermine today's value of purpose in businesses. More and more, the value of purpose in businesses is growing, and people are demanding it. People want to relate to companies with goods and services that share their values. But also, there has to be the possibility of the economic benefit, which I believe the margin there is, because we have this great gap between negative interest rates and abusive interest rates. So there must be somewhere in between. In the case of Costa Rica, for COVID, we proposed an initiative called FACE, Fund to Alleviate COVID Economic, to address these three crises. In FACE, what we propose is that we finance long-term investments with fixed interest rates to give certainty to our countries, and aiming to low interest rates, but fixed so we can start repaying that. And that will be very similar to what Europe did and had to do after the World War II, because if not, the burden is too heavy on the countries and on the people. So I believe that's the missing link. Actually, what we are talking here today, it's the key missing link to unlock all our targets and the real targets of the COP26 and what we need to do now, because we see the planet entering in a very difficult phase, and every data is showing that we are off track. So this discussion might be one, if not the most important discussion to address and to solve. I also want to mention that it's relevant and key for the countries, the rich countries, the developed countries, G20 countries and G7 countries to be part of this, because we know that it's 20 countries that produce 80% of the emissions, and that they are the ones that have the most resources. So today, the best way to be, this is the scenario when solidarity and self-defense are on the same page, ironically. Both working in solidarity and working somehow selfishly are the same. And the same is to invest in development. And what we can provide as the ones that have solutions is provide tranquility by providing clear traceability, measurement, and being accountable on those investments. So those are the thoughts I wanted to share, and also I want to listen to others on this. But as I mentioned, this might be the most relevant discussion towards Glasgow. This is the one that we need to click in order to change and for the future generations. No pressure to you all, but but anyway, thank you very much, and I'm here available to listen to others and also to answer some questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency, for providing such an inspiring vision while also covering a number of concrete examples and points, especially as countries grapple with the triple crisis of COVID, the fiscal crisis, but also climate change. And I think, again, your points about looking at profit from a moral, social, economic, and financial perspective is well noted, as also how we can address the missing link to catalyze the additional financing. So thank you so much, and really congratulations again to Costa Rica for winning the Earthshot Prize yesterday. Yannick, I don't know if you would like to make some remarks, reflections.
Yeah, I fully agree with His Excellency that it might be the key issue at the heart of climate finance. And if we can make it even more complex, President, the default rates are not correlated with the risk rating by credit agencies. So it's we can add another layer to that paradox. But I believe that now we should give the floor to Professor Lee White.
If I can just, absolutely, we're in the right direction. And indeed, I think I'd now like to invite Henry to moderate the panel with Professor Lee White and Jacqueline and Joan. Over to you, Henry, please.
Thank you very much, Babita. Thank you very much, President Alvarado. Thank you, Yannick, for providing a very, I would say, exhaustive backdrop of some of the challenges and some of the opportunities. So the idea of this exchange now is to bring different voices, the voice from another government in Africa that is also very committed to the climate change action, a CEO of a private fund that has been working in bridging those worlds that President Alvarado was talking about: solidarity, prosperity, and inclusion. That's Jacqueline Novogratz. And also we have John Larea, who at Convergence is trying to really make the case for blended finance, showing how all of this could be aligned. But I would like to start, if I may, with Professor Lee from Gabon. I was very impressed by learning that Gabon is one of the few countries that is carbon positive. And we would like to perhaps hear from you what has been Gabon's strategy to reach that, and what's the strategy to maintain that contribution at a moment that everybody is pledging for reductions, and they are far from possibly arriving at those reductions, and you are already on the positive side. So, Mr. White, if you could provide us with some of those lessons and some of your reflections on that. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. President, for your inspiring remarks. Yeah, Gabon is a high forest, low deforestation country, 88% covered by forest, and we currently are net absorbing just over 100 million tons of CO2 every year. So we're net absorbing a third of France's emissions. We've been able to maintain that carbon sequestration over the last 30 years through a series of strong government decisions about how we manage our natural resources. So how we harness, as the president said, how we harness nature-based solutions. And something we did about 10 years ago, President Bongo Ndimba banned the export of raw logs from Gabon 10 years ago. When we looked at the economics of forestry in Gabon, and you could read forestry in Africa or Central Africa, typically the natural resources were being exported unprocessed from Africa, and all of the value was being added offshore, initially in Europe and the US, and then later on in Asia. So when you do that, something between 5 and 10%, about 8% in Gabon's case, of the revenues, of the cash flow, and something like 8% of the jobs are created in Gabon, and over 90% of the economy based on our timber resources, and 90% of the jobs are offshore, which results in our undervaluing the forest. And for forests to continue to stand into the future, forests have to be valuable. We have to value their ecosystem services, but they have to contribute to the economy of the nations where they are growing. So by banning the export of raw logs, by pushing for transformation in country, first, second, third level transformation, we make the forest more and more valuable to the nation, and we create more and more jobs, which creates a constituency that's putting pressure on me, the Minister of Forestry, to get my forest management policies right. Because if our timber products are not sustainable, legal, climate positive, biodiversity positive, and socially responsible, nobody's going to buy them. Now, what we need to make these decisions really sustainable is we need investment, responsible investment in Africa, to produce semi-finished and finished products on the African continent. So we need investment in sophisticated timber processing. Unfortunately, most investors in Africa are looking for a 30 or 40% profit, because they don't have confidence in most of our nations to invest in longer term, more sustainable investment. And so if we're going to turn this around, we need to look at how we can promote responsible private sector investment, where they will accept to get their money back in 6 or 8 years instead of in 3 or 4 years. We have to make that the capital cheaper. We have to look at sovereign back guarantees, that sort of thing. And if I to finish, just take a look outside of Gabon. We're convinced that we can maintain our forests if we go down this line, and that by sustainably exploiting the forest, we can save the forest. Bigger picture, there are huge projects in Africa like the Inga Dam, which is a huge run of the river and therefore ecologically not kind of sound project that would enable us to replace all of the coal-fired electricity plants in Southern Africa with cheap green energy, and could give energy to half of the African continent. But we have to mobilize $80 billion of investment, and we have to do that in a country that currently has some problems. And so I think really getting together and thinking about how we can make sustainable investments in nature-based solutions something that is secure and profitable is definitely the way forwards.
Thank you, Minister Lee. Indeed, similarly to President of Costa Rica, you're trying to bridge these two worlds together. And I think the next speaker, Mr. Hart from the UN, it's tasked at the Secretary General to lead the climate action team. And Mr. Lee, if you allow me, I will now pass to Mr. Hart. Mr. Hart, if your sound was correct, I would like to have you. Otherwise, I'll try you later. If you can just give me a sign in case you are connected, and I will be able to provide you. Could you just speak to see whether your sound is working well? Thank you.
Hi, Henry. Can you hear me, Henry?
It's still not so clear.
Okay.
I'm going to ask our IT team to see how we can help you, and I'll come back to you in a few rounds, if that's okay. Thank you so much. Pleasure. Perhaps Jacqueline, I guess I'd love to maybe transition from you as a leader in the private sector, but that private sector that President Alvarado was talking about, of combining the moral compass with prosperity and inclusion. And I think it would be really nice to sort of hear from Acumen's journey in somehow shifting those paradigms that somehow bring profit making with development aligned, and especially some of your experiences in areas like sustainable agriculture or access to energy, where you have been working on that for the past 20 years.
Thanks so much, Henry, and thank you, Yannick, Babita. It's just always such an honor to be here with GCF, and I agree with everyone about the importance of this conversation. Also, the comments of President Alvarado and also Minister White so resonate with the experience that Acumen has had through the years. Just to level set, Acumen is a nonprofit organization. We've actually invested in entrepreneurs solving big challenges of poverty across off-grid energy, agriculture, healthcare, and education for over 20 years. At the core of the model is what we would call patient capital. And so it really relates to, again, what both of you talk about, which is long-term philanthropic backed capital, so that we could build, enable entrepreneurs to solve these very wicked problems of poverty. And through one example in off-grid energy, I think there's a real opportunity to link what the two of you have been talking about, and I believe it's so critical for the world. But since you spoke before, President Alvarado, we work in Pakistan, India, East and West Africa, Latin America, though not as much in Costa Rica, and the United States. And that includes sustainable supply chains in coffee. So lots of conversations there. But today, really, I want to talk about Africa, and then I want to talk about energy and agriculture, because President Alvarado particularly talked about the disproportionate impact on the poor and how unfair it is that people in the developing world are paying the price of what the developed countries have done for so long. And so when we have this conversation about the climate crisis, it's too easy to only focus on large-scale mitigation without also recognizing that low-income communities and nations also have to develop economically in ways that help avert long-term climate crisis. Getting back to Africa, you've got a continent where 45% of the people have no access to electricity, and the median age is 19.7. And so this is an imperative at every level: productivity, a social justice, a moral imperative, a security imperative. We started in this area of off-grid way back in 2007, again, with our philanthropic capital. We started to invest in companies that were building real solutions to allowing people to get affordable, accessible off-grid solar energy at the household level. After about 7-8 years of doing that, we saw that some of these companies were truly ready to scale. And our assumption was that more traditional impact capital would come flooding in. But as you both have alluded, wasn't the case. We didn't have exits to offer, and we were operating in risky, quote unquote, risky areas. And we understood that this would still be a 10 to 12 year investment period. That is when the flexible capital, the long-term capital of GCF played such a critical role. We partnered with GCF. They made the first investment of $20 million that enabled us to raise a $70 million impact fund that would very specifically focus on getting 10 million people in Rwanda and Kenya specifically, but across Africa, access to affordable solar electricity, improve the value of off-grid solar. And to date, Conducive, which is the name of that fund, has brought 100 million people access to electricity and averted 16.7 million tons of carbon. What I didn't understand when we started in 2015 with GCF is that that partnership also allowed us understanding and voice, so that during the pandemic, when it was clear that many companies across this still emerging off-grid solar sector that is such critical infrastructure to a continent's development was at risk, we were able to reach out to the overall sector, catalyze a fund with 16 other institutions. And again, that fund would not have happened without anchor support, $30 million from GCF. That now has had a first close of 68 million, and we're hoping we'll have a second close quite soon of 87 million to provide very low cost concessionary debt to the companies that comprise the off-grid solar space. That space is so critical because it represents 400,000 jobs. And I would say that those jobs are not just jobs, they are truly careers. And we need more such evidence and accountability, like President Alvarado was talking about. We've now become the largest off-grid investor in the world. 30% of all people who have off-grid solar are customers of the companies that Acumen, and underneath it, the for-profit fund Conducive has invested in. So we have a sight line to what it will actually take to achieve SDG 7. But again, to echo what both of you talked about, if we just look at traditional investing, we are not going to reach the 230 million people who are the hardest to reach on the planet. We need to recognize that in this moment of severe inequality, which is a part of the crisis, the climate conversation, we need to find ways to move capital to where it is most needed and not just to where it is safe. I can talk more if I have time. Henry, you let me know about what we're also doing in agriculture with Green Climate Fund.
Yes, please do.
Okay, so there hasn't been another institution like GCF that has taken the kinds of risk that help move capital to where it's most needed rather than where everybody wants to play it safe. And so the third example moves from the energy space into the adaptation and resilience space in agriculture, because obviously at this moment, our smallholder farmers are most at risk. And when we look across our portfolio, particularly in Africa, the smallholder farmers have had to deal with drought, floods, and locusts all in the same year of a pandemic. And so when we went to create an agriculture fund, because of the trust that President Alvarado was talking about, because of the moral component and the shared values in terms of what we were trying to achieve for the poor, GCF was willing to work with us, and they pushed us. It was GCF that really talked to us about adaptation and resilience. We were the first fund to do that, so we weren't quite clear on the instruments for accountability and measurement. And so together with the World Resources Institute, developed a mechanism to actually measure resiliency. GCF did more. They came in with a $23 million first loss facility so that we could then crowd in private capital with no promises, but at least the possibility of reducing downside risk. And side by side with initial grant support from GCF, we're able to raise $7 million fully in grants so that we can provide not only technical assistance, but look at issues like gender, again, do more to measure impact from the perspective of low-income people and from the environmental perspective of adaptation and resilience. And so it's a third example of where we can be more creative, more flexible in structuring disciplined, long-term, financially credible instruments by recognizing that we need the right kind of capital to focus on the right kinds of problems so that we can actually solve the problems that we have as a world. That is why we feel so proud, not in a flattering way, but hopefully in a way that can role model what it means to work with an institution like GCF, because from our perspective, it has been one of the only institutions that has been willing to work and put the kind of capital into the hands of people who can really make the most difference on the ground. I feel too many of the conversations we have with traditional stakeholders veer into the land of trade-offs. We want to believe there are no trade-offs. We want everything to be win-win. And those two approaches, I feel, have been part of getting us to where we are. And instead, we have to recognize that some of us have to be willing to trade so that we can create a just, inclusive, and sustainable world. And that is the challenge on the table for the private sector, for government, and for civil society.
Thank you very much, Jacqueline. It's always inspiring to hear the journey, and we are proud to be partners. And it's a two-way street. We've also learned a lot on how to adapt some of our instruments and how to work together in order to address some of those most needed that you're trying to reach. So keep up that great work. I would like to now invite Joan Larrea. Joan is the CEO of Convergence. Convergence is the blended finance industry body that is trying to make the case of how we can move from the billions to the trillions. And climate finance remains one of the top areas and sectors where capital is flowing, but there's still a gap. And Joan, it would be great to hear from you. What are some of those bottlenecks? Yannick already mentioned a few, but it would be interesting from your side, especially in the climate finance, and how can we somehow work together to address them and to have more capital flowing to these areas that are so important. Thank you, Joan.
Thank you, Henry. And it's wonderful to go later in the program so I get the benefit of all of the remarks of everyone else, because I'm going to be echoing some of them. I think that it is not enough for governments and for the private sector each to operate separately anymore. We need to rewire or even short circuit the wires of international finance if we are going to address our climate emergency. It's a crisis and we need to move fast and we need to move together. We know that there are some serious efforts underway and wonderful track records already by nations like Costa Rica and Gabon. We see the US returning to the conversation. We know that the private sector is highly interested in the climate field. Since about 2018, 47% of all commitments for climate have originated from commercial sources. And we also know that institutional investors, there's a big mind shift happening among them as well. Instead of only thinking about the risks of investment, and Jackie is right and others who have spoken are right, that the risks are perceived as very high in the emerging markets, the developing countries. Instead of only thinking about those risks, the institutional investors of the world are asking themselves more and more about the risks of inaction, of doing nothing, the doing nothing scenario. So you have the big money arriving on the scene. So the blockage, if you will, is to date, these forms of capital have moved separately. So what does it mean to move together toward a climate friendly position? And we would advocate, obviously, that blended finance is a tool that should be remembered and deployed when it's appropriate toward the objective of moving more capital into areas that address the climate emergency. And blended finance, just to put the definition out there, is the strategic use of catalytic funds, the kind of money that Green Climate Fund has to deploy. The use of catalytic funds to increase private sector investment in areas that support the Sustainable Development Goals. So what we know is that governments do not have the money to go it alone. The private sector does have the money, but has a fiduciary duty to do the safe thing, as Jackie used the expression safe, and think about risks versus returns. So blending gets to be really important if you're trying to move money into the right places. And it can be pure grants. It can be the patient capital she mentioned. It can be soft loans. It can be junior equity. It can be the kinds of things that President Alvarado is talking about, which is payments for capital or payments for natural capital services. Or it can be very early stage support from those who have grant money to deploy, which we would consider it convergence to be design funding or maybe preparatory funding. And there's an interesting thing that happens when you all move together, by the way. The money gets more intelligent in certain aspects. You have more of an awareness. If there's a donor in a transaction alongside a private sector investor, you have more awareness, I think, of, for example, the gendered aspects of climate change and of the path out of climate change. And people become more cognizant of the role of local communities if you have, say, a host government in the transaction. So the financing itself gets more resilient if it's blended many times. I think that although there is a lot left to do on the renewables front, there is a lot of renewables financing that is actually pretty commercially sustainable on its own these days. And it is adaptation that needs the focus from the blended finance community. It is still really hard to finance adaptation. From 2015 to 2020, there was about $11 billion of blended finance that went into adaptation, as compared with about $35 billion for mitigation. So it is the tougher of the two nuts to crack. Adaptation activities for agriculture and for resource management are becoming really big issues in the blended finance area for adaptation. 68% of adaptation transactions that we know of in 2018 to 2020 were for agriculture and natural resources management. And what we see at Convergence is blended finance for adaptation is better at capturing gender and being gender aware than the transactions we are seeing elsewhere, including in the mitigation space. But a critical choke point, Henry, to answer one of your questions, is in the early stage ideation around transactions, there are not enough transactions that are put out to the market that are investable because of that lack of early stage very soft financing or grant support to come up with new transactions that address adaptation. Design stage grants have mobilized about 3.5 billion in total climate financing. And if you look at adaptation deals versus mitigation deals, they are much more likely to have needed design stage granting in order to become successful at raising capital. About 21% of adaptation transactions in the blended space have used design funding. And it's because it takes innovation, it takes creativity, and you have a very unproven business model often when you present an adaptation deal to the market. A couple of things we're doing at Convergence that may be of interest to this community or this conversation. First of all, we are running design stage or design funding windows. And secondly, we're working with the UK Foreign Commercial and Development Office, FCDO, on a COP26 platform. So I can talk about both of those if you'd like now or a little bit later, Henry. Let me ask you what your preferences might be.
Thank you, Joan. No, thank you. You can go ahead and talk about those initiatives, please.
Okay, I'd be glad to. We want to make sure people are aware of them. First of all, on the design funding front, we have several grant windows operating right now. These are all aimed at providing funding to teams working at the ideation stage, very early stage on transactions they hope one day to bake enough to present them to the market. We have an Asia Pacific natural capital window funded by RS Group out of Hong Kong. And we have an Indo-Pacific resilient infrastructure and gender window financed by the government of Australia. Both of these are open and accepting applications. We are about to announce another grant window in collaboration with the government of Canada that's going to be for gender responsive climate structures. These are ideas in which gender is not a bolt-on, but is an integral part of the business concept that is being worked on. We've got other plans and other partnerships coming down the line, but if you go to our website, you can see these, www.convergence.finance. These are grant windows that are open right now. The other thing that we're working on is this COP26 platform. What happened there was that we and the UK FCDO got together and decided to do a few things toward financing climate at scale. So these are not small transactions, these are large transactions that could pull in institutional money from pension funds, money from insurance funds, insurance companies. So this platform first is designed to raise donor knowledge of blended finance solutions that can mobilize capital at scale. We did a call for proposals among the donors to ask them what transactions they knew about to create a long list of climate transactions that might be financeable with some of their support. We've winnowed down that long list to a short list with the idea of helping these donors think about co-funding 3 to 8 blended finance transactions that can mobilize at scale. And now we are engaging with private sector investors, the other half of the coin, to increase their commitment or interest in these same transactions. So just summarizing here, business as usual is not going to work. We need that meeting of the minds that President Alvarado talked about between the private sector and governments. We can't have everybody operating in their own lanes if we're trying to solve this dilemma or this problem we've put ourselves in. Secondly, blended finance in all of its many forms is underused and is a helpful tool to bridge those worlds. Third, we're working at Convergence to try to bring everybody up to speed on how to use blended finance and to put people in the same room. We will be issuing our State of Blended Finance 2021 on October 27th, so that will provide some more information for everybody on what is going on. But finally, if I just can say this, it is ultimately the prime movers in this conversation, the governments, the grantors, the investors of the world, who have to decide to break some patterns, who have to decide to cross-wire their wiring diagrams of how their money flows and move money faster and at a much, much bigger scale, and to do it together. It has to be done together. And that's what we'd like to leave you all with from our conversation today.
Thank you very much, Joan. I think it's indeed paradigm shifting. That's how we call it here at GCF, and it's core to what we do. I think President Alvarado also mentioned. I'd like to excuse Mr. Hart. He remained having technical difficulties, so we hope we can bring him in. So what I'd like to do now is do another round and maybe go back to President Alvarado. You've been listening to some of the remarks of your fellow panelists, and I would like to see whether you would like to share any reflections or reactions to some of the things that have been discussed, or also provide further examples of how Costa Rica remains leading in this area, especially as we go to COP26.
Thank you. Well, first I wanted to comment on or react to some of the remarks made by previous speakers, by Jacqueline and by Joan. First, I think one key insight mentioned by Jacqueline, and I think we need to underline this, is how the alliance of the GCF with private sector helped to be an anchor. I think that we need to underline this, because my approach, my reading on this is that it's somehow a sharing of risks, but also a way of bringing people together. So this, it's an example that I think is very strong and very positive. And when Jacqueline mentioned it, something I wrote it down, because might be a good practice to reproduce, because it also, as in her examples, helped pave the way to helping many people in Africa in the off-grid sector. So that it's a learning I take for myself, and it's a good one. I think that's something we need to put there. Something that Joanne mentioned on adaptation a lot. I love the gender part of it, because yes, gender is also a big part of this discussion. And yes, we have found similarly that adaptation has been very difficult to finance, and also because it might seem also more complex. So I also take that necessity to learn more of these soft or grants at the beginning. Design is more complex, but because we are in a new territory, most of us, in terms of climate change. So that understanding that, and understanding that long-term or mid-term is necessary in finance for this to work. Two more comments. One on agriculture. Agriculture in the developing world is becoming very risky, very risky. Why? Because of the floods, because of drought, because of extreme weather. So in traditional schemes of finance in agriculture is becoming very expensive for small farmers and for families. This is also a problem in terms of food security for many countries. I mean, we're talking about the human safety of many of the people. So also finding adequate schemes for adaptation, but for financing agriculture is one of the key challenges in regarding to climate change. And I wanted to underline that because it's one of the big crises in the area of environment: climate change, biodiversity, and desertification or the pressure to feed the world. And finally, more let's call it a philosophical thought. I think we need to be courageous in this area, and I think that we need to encourage businesses, countries, and everyone at this stage to be early adopters. That means to move forward. Why? I think there's lots of discussion and lots of pressure on getting it right the first time. But we need to learn, and sometimes we need to get it wrong to understand what works and what doesn't. But as the clock is ticking in terms of climate change, we need to be courageous and be early adopters, and also have the courage to learn and to adapt and to share what went right, what went wrong. Also in terms of finance. I mean, that's why I feel optimistic with this kind of examples, because it means that it's possible and it has been possible. But then we need to multiply those. And we also need to share what went wrong. There's a huge pressure of getting the right examples, the success examples, and that's okay. But we also need to learn what's more common, which is error, and to learn from it, and to find how people corrected that. In our case, in Costa Rica, being early adopters in case of forest protection or renewable energies came with its costs. I mean, we became leaders in conservation of forests because we did terrible before that. I mean, we went from 80% of forest coverage to 20%. I mean, we were a mess. But then we pull our act together and we learn in how to make it profitable. Also, we developed very early on a system of renewable clean energies, but also those had an impact on, for example, on several relevant rivers, and then we need to protect those as well. So being early adopters pays off, is good, also provides learnings that we need to share our mistakes. But at this point in terms of finance, we need to be courageous and accept that sometimes, this is going to sound weird, but sometimes we're going to mess up. But then we need to write a paper and say, okay, this went wrong, this went right, that's how we fix it. And then we need to share it and say, guys, please don't do this, or we did this. Don't walk our path in this way, but this is how we correct it, and this is how we suggest it should be done. Being early adopter and drawing from good examples, I think, is critical at this stage. And I think that both Jacqueline and John have provided insights of things that work that are not necessarily evident, that we need to share more with both with private sector and governments. I've been with plenty of leaders that they want to move in this direction, but sometimes we don't have the tools or the necessity, the specifics to go, the blueprints. We need to have more of those.
Thank you, President Alvarado. Indeed, it's important to learn, it's important to continue adapting, and I think that's really good. Into a segue that I would like to ask a question from the audience that has been asked for Yannick, if I may. In this learning and innovation of GCF, there's a question about how can GCF come up with innovative investment instruments or investment products that could influence asset allocation strategies, especially of asset owners or large holders of capital. How could we also invite them to the table and somehow bring in that blending that John was mentioning?
Thanks. It's a very interesting questions. I would maybe start with one of the last comments of President Alvarado. The clock is ticking, and we need to encourage early adopters. The clock is ticking. And if we want to avert catastrophic climate change, we have to use a few $1 billion of public money that we have in a highly catalytic manner to move trillions of dollars. And right now it's not happening. The leveraging ratio of public finance, especially public climate finance, is 1 to 1 to 1, 1 to 1 to. So that means with 1 billion, we move 1 billion, 200 million. At that speed, we are not to make a big difference. And so we need to reinvent climate finance, and we need to reinvent blended finance. And so for me, it's we have to experiment with different type of instruments that could have a much higher impact on the shifting financial flows. And Joanna has mentioned some of them. where, for example, we know that why sovereign loans might have a very limited leveraging impact. Other instruments such as the early finance for feasibility studies, or anchor investment for equity, or first loss equity, or guarantees can have a much greater impact. So we don't have the choice. We have to basically innovate, come with new forms of blended finance in order to move much larger financial flows, but also in order to make it work better for adaptation, better for ecosystem, better for the most vulnerable. And right now it's not working for adaptation, it's not working for ecosystem, it's not working for the most vulnerable, at least the traditional form of blended finance. So I fully subscribe to some of the comments of Bob, Jacqueline, and Joanne. We have to come with new forms of financing instruments. For GCF, part of our missions is basically to foster innovation. So it can be technological innovation, but also financing innovation. And so when we look at the projects, even if it's something not tested, even if it's an early mover, early adopter, that's something we can consider if the impact in terms of climate change is commensurate. I think it would be another discussion, but we should certainly stop speaking about leveraging ratio and more catalytic effect. At the end of the day, we are not in the business for GCF. We are not in the business of trying to de-risk one project. We are in the business of creating and developing green markets, because it's only when you have created or developed a green market that you move the money at scale. And so what we have to figure out is what kind of projects are actually market creating. What kind of early adopters will basically create a real market. And so all of this to say that for us, we are definitely interested in this kind of dialogues that can basically identify new form of specialty finance that could enable us to have a catalytic impact to move from billions to trillions through creating and developing new markets.
Thank you very much, Yannick. Indeed, the systemic angle in making this something that somehow stays and sticks in the long term. I'd like to now turn it to Mr. Lee, Professor Lee from Gabon. I think Africa is indeed core to a lot of this, and African states is a priority of GCF and many other funders. However, sometimes the flow of capital is slow. The capacities or the realities in Africa, it's obviously there are bottlenecks on macro and micro issues. I'd like to perhaps ask you if you could address how is Gabon addressing some of those macro and micro issues that would enable Gabon and the Gabonese to access more funding and have a lot more capital that could hopefully serve the most disenfranchised.
Thank you. If you'll allow me, I just did one of those back of the envelope calculations, and I think we're losing about 500,000 hectares of Congo Basin rainforest to agriculture, shifting cultivation, slash-burn farming, which is a technology that's over 2,000 years old. If you use the sort of modern tropical agriculture that Costa Rica is using to grow food, to grow coffee and cocoa and so on, you can be 20 times more productive. You can fix people on the same piece of land, and therefore you can be carbon positive. Now, if forest carbon was worth $10 a ton, and that's a low price, that's 2.5 billion tons, $2.5 billion worth of CO2 that's going up every year because of deforestation in the Congo Basin. Why don't we have a $2.5 billion fund to promote modern tropical agriculture in Congo Basin? Why aren't we putting our sort of our money where our mouth is? We talk about forest carbon, and I remember Costa Rica famously backing out of FCPF because it costs $18 a ton to create the ton of carbon, but the price is $5 a ton. I hope I got that right, Mr. President. But why don't we have a $2 billion fund? That's just the equivalent of 1 year of emissions. I think we need to be looking big. We need to be thinking, how does the GCF catalyze major private sector investment in these natural systems which can be productive? You can exploit wood in Gabon and at the same time increase carbon stocks and save the rainforest. You could easily do modern tropical agriculture in some of these countries and increase carbon stocks, increase productivity, increase food security. And if you integrate sort of agroforestry into agriculture, if you maintain a mosaic of natural forest and managed forests, the system will be so much more resilient as well to the problems that we're seeing, the droughts and so on. So I'm sorry, I didn't really answer your question, but I felt like I had something to put out there.
No problem, Professor Lee. You actually answered one of the questions that we received from the audience, which is exactly around the carbon markets as a pillar of the Paris Agreement and how to tackle it. So you did better than, I'm glad you did that because I had that question also up for you. Thank you very much. Jacqueline, I recall, from the Blue Sweater book that you wrote, your commitment to those that are left behind. In the recent conversation that we had with Yannick, you were very focused on reaching those that are not reached, on the energy access, energy-wise, and on the agriculture. Can you tell us a little bit about, why the markets are broken there and why there are both market failures and state failures in addressing those that need it the most?
Sure. Henry, in fact, when Minister White was speaking, I was thinking about all of the different constraints that, when I started doing this work of investing in low income communities and building markets that had never existed, I assumed that markets were markets. But when you're looking at markets where low income people live, I almost have come to the point where I would characterize them as political economies more than market economies in some ways, because everybody has their hands in the fates of low income people, whether it is government officials or in the cases of slums, mafias or business people that would take advantage, or family structures or religious leaders. And so it's much more complex to actually then therefore build viable functioning markets where low-income people can have real choice over their own lives. And we've learned now through that patient capital that really has been able to reward the early adopters and accompany them sometimes for 10 to 15 years so that they can actually build those viable companies that a Kawisafi or an ARAF, the agriculture fund, could invest in, because you've taken into consideration all of these other challenges and learned what it means to build the talent pool and to build the kinds of companies that are needed. Where I would disagree with what Joan said about energy access is that it's true that markets are now functioning in an area that were completely dysfunctional 15 years ago, and that is a great victory. But the 230 million people that I was talking about are people that will not be reached with the markets as they exist today. They exist in primarily 85% of them in 15 African nations. Some of those nations actually are quite rich with oil or diesel. And so there are real challenges in terms of confronting, again, the status quo. And yet we have a chance to reach SDG 7. And the only way we will reach it, SDG 7, is if we use different kinds of capital, Henry, to reach those people who right now too many people think are unreachable. To do it, what makes it possible to do it today, and it wouldn't have been possible even 5 years ago. And again, I give credit to the partnership with GCF to enable the Kawisafi to crowd in other investors and build confidence in this market, is that we now have companies like D-Light and B-Box and BioLight, which are $50, $75, $100 million companies that have the capability to go into nations like Benin and Burundi and DRC, and I could name the 15, but they need first and foremost grants so that they can build the infrastructure, find the local distributors, build the capabilities of those local distributors so that they can actually help them reach people who otherwise wouldn't have access. And we believe that to provide incentives for them to go into those areas, and we're working with them on exactly what those incentives are, there's a real opportunity for a creative solution, which would be an impact discount. So in other words, if a company is successful in reaching 1 million people in one of the frontier markets when it comes to off-grid energy, and we're talking about countries where in some cases, less than 20% of the population is electrified, then we would almost act like a government rebate. And the $1 million invest or $5 million lent to them, they would only have to pay back 4.5 with the 10% discount. That this is the way that we start to not only ensure energy access, but we take very seriously the for all. And we start by designing for the people that have been overlooked, underestimated, and fully left out of opportunity, which today is absolutely the immoral thing to do. And frankly, as a world, if SDG 7 is the one that we have the chance to really realize, then we have to do it. I would just end by saying, Henry, that what President Alvarado said that really moved me is that we need the early adopters. What I also heard in what he said, we need role models. We need examples of where there have been successful innovations that ultimately have served the poor in ways that are sustainable and long-term do good with their investors. And I think a role for GCF can be to highlight those role models and to think about how we communicate these stories and the narrative about inclusive, sustainable development in ways that, to Joan's point, are no longer bifurcated, but insist on government, civil society, and the private sector working with a different kind of urgency. And so that's where I'll end. But I do agree that adaptation is the next big frontier. It is not as easy to measure. It is so critical. And yet we're starting to see real measurements of where low-income people can have more power over their own decision-making and their own lives in the face of wild uncertainty and instability. And that is where dignity lives. And so what's needed more than anything is our collective moral imagination.
Thank you very much, Jacqueline. Indeed, it's the Amartya Sen, development as freedom, right? Indeed, to provide that dignity, to provide that agency that people really require. And this is something that I think, all strive to do. Thank you very much. Joan, perhaps on your case, I think Yannick mentioned some of the importance of being catalytic. And perhaps one could also assess that maybe certain investors try to cherry pick deals that maybe are not as catalytic or are not there. And this is both public investors and private investors. How could we as a community as well that wants to really reach that climate action and mobilize more money, somehow keep people more honest, track the impact, provide an opportunity for people to really somehow go where they should be going. That is, looking at the risk-adjusted return, but obviously being conscious that impact is also another part of that equation. Any thoughts on your side and given Convergence footprint across many investors?
Yeah, so first of all, I do think that measurement of impact is starting to enter the DNA of the truly private sector, for-profit, large investor, because the ultimate source of the money behind those institutions is you and me. It's your pension fund. It's your insurance company. And the more that we demand things, the more it trickles through the system until finally it becomes something that the US SEC requires, assessment of social risk, assessment of climate risk. So I think that caring about impact will continue to enter the conversation in louder and louder ways. How you measure it, those sorts of things, I would leave to firms that are much better and more schooled at that than perhaps Convergence is. I do want to go to something that Yannick mentioned and not debate it, but perhaps tweak it a bit. We were talking about innovation and Yannick led on that one. I think long before we get into really nifty, cool, innovative things, we need to fine tune the things that are being used by donors and catalytic capital providers today and get them to be even better, and get this set of actors to be even more forcefully entering the conversation. We have, official development aid stalled at about 152 billion a year, and we're talking about trying to move trillions, and we're talking about a crisis. So if that supply of money is set, it is the principal impediment to more blended finance happening unless we make it more effective. So I think that innovation should look like taking things that worked in place A or industry A and applying them to place B or industry B, as opposed to coming up with something wildly new. The problem with wildly new is that when you try to scale it, when you try to get your pension fund and my insurance company to invest in it, they have no idea what it is. They don't understand it. They don't like it. So coming back to you, Henry, they're not going to bite into that opportunity. It needs to look like the last 62 things that went by their credit committee. And the role of the donors and the creators and the fund managers and everybody else in the world is to serve up that set of money what it's used to eating. That takes an enormous amount of creativity on the catalytic side. How much catalytic money does it take to get a fund off and fund raised in the market? What terms will work from the catalytic side? What proportion do you need? How patient does it need to be? Does it need to be in there for 8 years, or in off-grid, it may be you need patient capital, coming back to Jacqueline's point. You may need patient capital in the off-grid renewable sector for decades. I mean, look what happened in the US in rural electrification. That wasn't commercial and still isn't today. So why are we expecting emerging markets to make it commercial in 8 years or 10 years and talking about off-ramps? So anyhow, coming back to innovation, I think it needs to look like repeating of patterns and making them bigger and getting the donor side, the catalytic side in the equation to really ask itself tough questions about, am I applying the right amount? Am I applying it in the right way? This is really precious money. It goes out the door once. What can I do to make my money go further? It needs to be issued faster, and it has to have terms that make sense. One of the things that greatly deters the private sector from a transaction is if it takes 2 years to have a conversation with the catalytic actor. We really, really need to speed up and get more effective in order to meet the speed of the private sector and to meet the speed of this crisis. Again, this is a self-extinction event. We need to treat it like one. Thanks, Henry.
Thank you very much, Joan. Indeed, I think it's important, the mainstreaming has to happen in one way or another, but it is important that innovation sits at the core. I would like to now ask my colleagues in IT to please present the video with the remarks of His Excellency Ali Bongo Ondimba, President of the Gabonese Republic, who wanted to be with us. However, due to a conflict, was not able to join us, but he kindly sent us a remark that obviously aligns to some of the conversation that we've been having. Over to you, IT.
President of the Republic of Costa Rica, dear Carlos Alvarado Quesada, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to warmly congratulate the Executive Director of the Green Climate Fund, Mr. Yannick Vermark, for hosting this 4th Green Climate Fund Private Investments Conference. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, in just 2 weeks, COP26 will begin in Glasgow. At a time when the COVID-19 pandemic has turned our societies, economies, and way of life upside down. COVID-19 revealed the weaknesses of our economies and health systems, forcing us to re-examine our development models and to make them more resilient. We must learn the lessons of this pandemic and rebuild our society on a more sustainable, equitable, and inclusive basis. This applies especially to Africa, where we will need to build infrastructure, develop human capital, invest massively in health infrastructure, and finally, break the vicious circle of our dependence on the export of raw materials. In the face of climate change, sustainable development has to be at the heart of our vision. Gabon is working towards a more sustainable economic recovery amid the current global health and economic crisis. We are determined to establish a clean and sustainable development model that exploits wealth without damaging or depleting it. I have entrusted my government with the implementation of a transformation acceleration plan whose ambition is to revive our economy by accelerating the transition to the post-oil era. To do this, the focus is on new growth engines, particularly in the mining, forestry, and agricultural sectors. We believe there is particular promise in the forestry sector through the sustainable harvest and the full transformation of our timber resources. Our goal is to use our green heritage, the forest, and its carbon sequestration capacity to ensure that our planet remains hospitable for future generations worldwide. By doing so, we will create a greener economy, new employment opportunities, and sustainable livelihoods. We will also nurture and increase long-term forest carbon absorption in Gabon, which currently results in our absorbing over 100 million tons more CO2 than we emit from the atmosphere each year. Our new climate change law and finalized FRL should allow us to develop these net carbon credits for a post-Glasgow Paris-compliant market. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, collectively, we must ensure that the climate change targets on which our future generations depend are met. Indeed, the consequences of climate change, including rising sea levels, recurrent hurricanes, and forest fires are putting our societies and communities under pressure and should make us aware of the urgency of working together. Specifically, I refer to the transfer of clean technologies and improving people's access to renewable energy to accelerate the transition to decarbonized, environmentally friendly industries. Fulfilling these commitments is crucial to support the efforts of countries like Gabon as we strive for a sustainable future. I hope to see you all in Glasgow. Thank you very much.
Thank you, President Ali Bongo Ondimba. Indeed, an inspiring message that puts us ready to the next challenge, which is Glasgow. And I think at the heart of his remarks, collective action was very, very clear. It has been a very inspiring discussion, and it's a privilege to have heard from the President of Costa Rica, from the Minister of Gabon, from Jacqueline at Acumen, from Joan Narea, and from Yannick. And I think all these views somehow converge into the need that we can do this all together, because this is definitely a great challenge that we all belong to. I would like to perhaps ask President Alvarado if you would like to provide us some closing remarks, especially in a segue to what the President of Gabon was mentioning about the need of collective action towards COP. And then I'll pass it on to Yannick for his closing remarks. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, and I really appreciate this this occasion, because it's a great moment not only for one to express thoughts, but to listen. And in this particular case, because we need to listen from private sector, from public sector, from developed world, from developing world, from different continents. So I believe it's the only way we're going to solve this. Also to stress on how urgent this is. The latest data and the latest reports mark that we are off track, way off track of the Paris Agreement. So this is urgent and critical. And most of the times, if not all of them, I mention this, but whenever I'm in this kind of discussion, what's on my mind, it's my 8-year-old son. Why? Because it's not like I'm going to work and then I'm going to be with him and we can put things apart. No, it's critical to get the job done in order for him and his generation and all these children in the world are going to have a better world. Today, half of the world's population is under 30 years. I mean, it's young people. And it's about them also. It's how we're going to change things. And as I mentioned, finance is critical. I urge all the experts and great people like the ones we've heard today and to join together and to do great stuff, to innovate, to be courageous, to teach others. I believe that's one of the ways that we're going to change things, and also that know that leaders need to be guided as well. A good leader needs sometimes to be led someplace. So for people that know in finance and also have that view of solidarity within markets, please help us crack this dilemma. Thank you.
Thank you, President Alvarado. It's been quite inspiring to listen to you and to the President of Gabon and to every single participant here. Yannick, some final remarks on your side.
Thanks, Henry. I will not try to recap these very rich discussions, but I would like to highlight two key features that were discussed tonight. The Nobel Prize winner Lucas wrote at the beginning of the 90s a paper called "Why Capital Does Not Flow to Developing Countries." And in a lot of regard, our discussion was very much why climate capital does not flow to developing countries. given that we have trillions of dollars of negative earning assets in OECD countries, and we have trillions of dollars of opportunities. But why we have negative interest rate assets in OECD countries, when it's reached developing countries, we end up with interest rates that's basically float between 20 to 50%. With extremely short tenors. So what does happen between this negative interest rate in OECD countries and this interest rate of 20 to 50% in developing countries? And clearly is basically an extremely adverse assessment of risk. And an extremely adverse assessment of risk, which first is not actually backed by default rates, and which most likely does not reflect the fact that in a changing climate, what was risky one day might be actually the safe thing to do today, and what was the safe thing to do yesterday might be the risky thing to do today. And so what is clear from the discussion that we have had today is that we need to reassess risk. And we need to basically look at climate change action and protecting our ecosystem, not as a risk, but as an investment. And we had some beautiful example from President Alvarado about basically the payback in terms of ecotourism and in terms of higher agricultural commodity price of having invested in going back from 20 to 50% of forest cover. Another key element for me of the discussion was that the importance of policies in order to reassess this risk, in order to de-risk investment. And here again, we had a couple of beautiful examples of policies that did value forest. And from the payment for ecosystem services in Costa Rica to the banning of raw logs in Gabon, and creating a local industry. That's their beautiful models. After we did discuss about the importance of the public sector to basically enable early adopters to take action, and the role of public sector through blended finance to basically de-risk this this pioneer projects. And we had a number of different tools, of different financial de-risking tools that were mentioned, from early anchor investment to early investment to basically project development funds. So financial de-risking tools that basically can complement this policy de-risking tools that we have discussed earlier. It was recognized that when it comes to blended finance, it works much better for mature technologies in mature markets than nascent technologies in nascent market, and that's and therefore we really have to make it work better for adaptation for the most vulnerable and for ecosystem solution. I think, Joanne, I would love to have a follow-up discussion with you on how do we make it work better, and what is innovation? Is innovation coming with new models? We're basically trying to come with going back to the blueprint and trying a different set of instruments, or is innovation a replication of pattern? Or maybe do we need both if we want to create a green market where we need to try something new, come with a new model, and once we have a model that has a commercially successful track record, basically start reproducing it in every single possible geography, and after transposing it to new sectors. At the end of the day, what we need is new asset classes. We need basically decentralized renewable energy, as mentioned by Jacqueline, to become a new asset class where our sovereign funds, our institutional investors basically look at it as a legitimate investment. And what is good for this off-grid renewable energy is also good for climate resilient infrastructure, is also good for new type of circular economy products such as recycled water, etc. And so for me, we have covered quite a lot of ground during this first session. And it was really great because we will now have for the rest of GPIC the opportunity for plenty of other participants to either deepen or challenge some of the points that have been made today. So on behalf of the Green Climate Fund, I would like to deeply thank all of you for participating in this opening session.
Thank you very much, Yannick. Indeed, I'd like to pass it on to Babita just to do the wrap up. Please, Babita.
Thank you so much to everyone, our distinguished speakers and all the participants too. We actually also got a statement from the president of Malawi, which we will share with the group subsequently. Thank you to the GCF teams who also worked very hard to organize this session. And as we all prepare for COP, please stay tuned to our events and engagements in Glasgow. And as an immediate step, we invite you all to join us for the next session of the conference that will focus on innovation for climate technologies, financing instruments, and business models. So thank you so very much.